következő előadónk Ioana Dobrescu, a Water Footprint Implementation ügyvezető igazgatója Hollandiából, aki igazából ezt a világszabványt, ez a szervezet, ezt a vállalati vízlábnyom számításnak a világszabványát fejlesztette ki. Az ő előadása angol nyelven lesz, és a kérdéseket is angolul várjuk az ő részére. Akkor átadom a szót. It's your turn, Ioana. Welcome on stage.
Thank you for the introduction, Edith. And hi, everyone. Allow me a second while I share my screen. So the final presentation for today will be on understanding the water issue with the water footprint concept. I've divided my talk for today in 4 main parts. It should take about 10 minutes. We'll start maybe taking a step back from the previous presentations that the previous speakers have talked about. We'll take a step back and we'll look at why are we talking about water in the first place, specifically talking about physical and regulatory drivers. Then we'll go into a short explanation about the water footprint and the water footprint assessment methodology, a few words about virtual water, and an example of a water footprint application for a business. So why are we talking about water in the first place? I think when we here in Europe are thinking about water issues, lack of access to water, water pollution, we always think about faraway countries, about images like this of people in Africa, people in Asia not having the sufficient access to water. And indeed that it is still a global problem where billions of people lack access to drinking water quality, good water quality for drinking all over the world. But this problem is also coming closer to home. And if you've looked at the news lately, I'm sure you've seen news such as this, that parts of Spain, for example, have been in the worst drought in decades, that Europe's next big crisis is water, also that pollution is affecting our water resources. And also here in Hungary, I've seen some of the news presented by the Hungarian news items. It's becoming a problem there too, both in terms of concerns of communities on future developments from the industry, what sort of effect will that have on water availability and water quality, and also simply water shortages due to the recent droughts brought by climate change. In this picture, you might wonder why there are boats in the middle of the desert. Well, that's because this is not a desert. This is the bed of what used to be the Aral Sea. And the reason why it's now turned into a desert is because the 2 rivers that were feeding it have been almost entirely diverted to irrigate cotton production. That's then, of course, being exported all across the world to be manufactured in clothes that we might be buying and wearing here in Europe or in other parts of the West. On the left-hand side of this image, you can see a time lapse of the water surface of the Aral Sea disappearing for the last 20, 30 years or so. And you can see that the Aral Sea has lost about 90% of its surface. And just for a reference, the total surface of the Aral Sea is about twice the size of Belgium as a country. Another example that you see here is of asparagus production in the desert of Peru. And if you're wondering if it's a good idea to start growing vegetables in a desert, well, the very obvious answer is no, it's not a good idea. And in this specific case, we can see that with the increase in production of asparagus, the groundwater table has descended quite a lot. And if the production of asparagus would continue, of course, the groundwater table would be depleted and it would have a very big negative impact not just on the business, but also on the communities that are relying on these same water resources for their drinking water. And of course, these are two examples from faraway regions of the world, but also here in Europe, we see the same type of effects of unchecked water consumption by businesses. This is an example from Spain, where strawberry production, primarily for export, also export to here to the Netherlands, has resulted in the drying up of one of the wetlands called the Cotodoniana. And these examples are primarily agricultural examples because the cause and effect are very easy to see. But of course, similar effects can be had by businesses in various industries like mining, textile production, chemical industry, heavy manufacturing. But those might be a bit more difficult to see because the impacts might not be directly surrounding the offices or the sites of operations, but they could have similar impacts in their supply chain. So what you've seen so far would be one of the physical drives, the physical risk that's driving companies and businesses to take action. But there are also new regulatory drives. If you've seen in the news recently, the EU is preparing a new package of directives that's addressing sustainability issues for corporations and financial institutions. And I think the most important directive that's going to affect companies is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the CSRD. This directive will apply to all companies listed on regulated markets in the EU, both to small and medium-sized, but also large companies that meet two of the three criteria listed here, but also to non-EU companies. I will not go into the details of the criteria for selection or the very fine details of this reporting directive. But what's important for businesses to understand from this regulation is that from now on, they will be required to report not just on the impact that climate change can have on the bottom line of the business, so the financial impact, but they also have to look at their own impact on the environment and on the people. And this is a concept that's called double materiality. Specifically for water, it's important for businesses to realize that they are required to start reporting on their impacts, risks, and opportunities, not just in own operations, but also in the value chain. And they will have to disclose information on what policies and actions they are taking to address these impacts, risks, and opportunities, and also what targets they are setting for more sustainable use of water in the future, and also for reduction of water use. All in all, this means a much more complex reporting process for which a lot of the companies that are targeted are not yet prepared for. Again, specifically for water, there are two subtopics, two standards that are addressing two subtopics of the environmental component of the ESG. And that would be the water and marine resources standard and the pollution standard. But of course, there are also indicators and metrics that could be found in the biodiversity, ecosystems, and climate change standards. So very concretely, what would companies have to disclose regarding water indicators and metrics? Well, first, they would have to identify which of their sites, which are their offices, assets, or activities are found in areas of water risk or water stress. And for this, companies can use the water risk filter, which our colleague from WWF has presented, the World Resource Institute Aqueduct, or our own water footprint assessment tool. They are required to disclose, as previously mentioned, any policies, actions, or targets that they have set to address the impacts, risks, and opportunities related to their value chain, total water consumption in own operations, consumption specifically in areas of water risk, contextual information on the water basin and how the data has been retrieved, the total water recycled and reused, water stored and changes in storage, contextual information relating to these two metrics, water intensity, which is basically the total water consumption or net revenue, and also emissions to water relating to pollution. So again, this is not an exhaustive list of indicators, metrics, and information that the companies will have to disclose, but it does list the main search factors. In addition to the CSRD, there's also another directive being developed at the moment called the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. And this will focus specifically on how businesses impact human rights and the environment. It will, just as the CSRD, focus also on supply chains, so not just in own operations. And the difference with the CSRD is that the due diligence directive will focus more on taking action to remediate these impacts. High impact sectors such as agriculture, textile, forestry, and fishing will face stricter requirements. And again, the targets for this directive are mostly large companies, but also companies from outside the EU who are doing business in the EU and meet certain size and employee criteria. So we've prepared a very short overview of these two main directives that will have an impact on how businesses report and take action on water. And we've also added the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation to the list because we see the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation and the CSRD as highly related. Investors will also have to start reporting and disclosing on their on the impact of their investments and their lending activities on the environment. And for that, they will request the companies they invest in to disclose that data. So on the one hand, companies will be required by regulations to disclose data on their water consumption, water practices, and they will also be asked by their investors to have access to the same type of data for their own financial reporting. So this was, let's say, the context setting in terms of drivers, physical risk and regulatory risk drivers. But what is a water footprint? Normally, if we are in a live setting, I would have a bit of interaction with the public. These questions would be asked directly, and I would hope to get an answer. But I'll ask the question and answer it myself. So how much water do you think it takes to make 1 cup of coffee? And if you consider a cup of coffee to be 125 milliliters, it would take about 130 liters to make 1 single cup of coffee. How much water does it take to make chocolate? We estimate somewhere around 3,400 liters to make a 200-gram bar of chocolate. And if you think about meat, for 1 kilogram of beef, it takes more than 15,000 liters to produce. And I will share a very short video with you that I hope also helps you understand the concept of a water footprint.
If you go to Piedmont Park, you'll see enormous blocks of ice. calling attention to the amount of water it takes to create ordinary things we use daily.
I've heard of a carbon footprint. I hadn't heard of the concept of a water footprint.
I would never have thought that a shirt would take that much water, and that's a lot.
People just aren't really aware.
Well, it makes you think about owning, 10, 20, 30 t-shirts.
It was never on my radar, but it is now.
Start taking small steps, one less thing here, one less thing there.
To be able to quantify how much water it actually takes to create an object is really powerful.
This was a project that we did in collaboration with IBM and the Weather Channel, and we provided data behind this awareness-raising campaign. And as somebody in the video was saying, the concept of a carbon footprint is much more familiar and has become much more popular among normal consumers and among businesses. But the concept of a water footprint is still growing in popularity, and not so many businesses and consumers understand its actual meaning. So what is a water footprint? Very simply put, it's the amount of water used to produce any good or service that we use. It's different from water withdrawals because it refers specifically to water consumption. Meaning if a business withdraws 1,000 liters of water, but it discharges 50% of that water back into the same water body from which it abstracted at the same quality, then its water footprint will be only 500 liters, whereas the water withdrawal will be the full 1,000 liters. As it was also explained before in the first presentation, we also talk about different types of water, and we color code them. So the green water footprint refers to rainwater, the water that's used in agriculture or by ecosystems to survive. The blue water footprint refers to surface and groundwater, and this has significance for agriculture, but also for industry and for our own domestic water consumption. And the gray water footprint refers to polluted water. And again, it's not the amount of polluted water that's being discharged, so wastewater, but it's the amount of water that would be necessary to dilute the pollution according to ambient water quality standards. It's a form of consumption because we say water that's being polluted is not available for other types of consumption. The water footprint concept is it's a concept of Dutch origin. It has been developed by Professor Arjen Hoekstra, who is a professor at the University of Twente, an expert and a pioneer in the water footprint concept. He was also our close advisor and part of our board until his untimely passing away. And Professor Hoekstra was the initiator of the methodology of the water footprint assessment, together with colleagues from academia. The methodology is laid out in the water footprint assessment manual that's publicly available. So any business or consumer or entity that's interested in performing a water footprint assessment can read the manual, can inform themselves, and attempt to perform a water footprint assessment. Professor Hoekstra, together with his colleagues at the university, established the Water Footprint Network more than 15 years ago, almost 20 years ago, in fact. And ourselves as Water Footprint Implementation, we have been established about 5 years ago to help put the academic water footprint concept into practice. So how does one perform a water footprint assessment? The methodology lays out 4 phases. Phase 1 being setting the goals and scope, meaning Are we performing a water footprint for a business, for a product, for a country, for a river basin? And what sort of questions are we trying to answer when we perform a water footprint assessment? Do we as a business want to find out if my water footprint is sustainable, or if I depend on water in any aspect of my operations or supply chain, or where in these elements is my water footprint the largest, and can it be reduced? The phase 2 is the water footprint accounting, so calculating the amount of green, blue, and gray water that is used in operation and in the value chain. Phase 3 is the sustainability assessment. So the water footprint value itself doesn't say much unless we place it in context. And that context looks at 3 main pillars. Is the water footprint environmentally sustainable? Is it economically efficient? And is it socially equitable? And finally, the fourth and last phase is the response formulation. So what type of actions can I take as a business to reduce my water footprint? Where do I need to focus first? As I mentioned, the water footprint concept measures water consumption, not just in operations, but across entire supply chains. So when we talk, for example, about 15,000 liters to produce a kilogram of beef, first we have to be aware that this number doesn't refer strictly to the water that the cow drinks, obviously. It starts with the water that's being used to grow the crop that is then being fed to the animal. In the next step of the livestock farming, the water that has been used at crop cultivation becomes an indirect water embedded in the feed. In the step of processing the meat, again, the water that has been directly consumed in the previous 2 steps of crop cultivation and livestock farming accumulated become the indirect water footprint, and they add to the direct water footprint that is used in the slaughterhouse for preparing the meat. And so on through the next steps of the retailer up until it reaches the supermarkets and the consumer. This is why when we say it takes 15 bathtubs to produce a single hamburger, this is how we reach these very high numbers. But as I mentioned, just calculating the amount of water that it takes to produce product. And the one thing that I forgot to mention in the previous slide is that this 15,000 liters refers to an average across the world. So it's not a country-specific or a product-specific value. It doesn't refer to cows that come or that are being grown in France, for example. It's a global average. To be able to offer the sustainability context, we need to look at how each of the elements that make up the product, how the water that was used to produce them fares in terms of taking the example of this latte. If we look at the water component of the water footprint, so really the water that's contained in the coffee itself, we have to look at is that water coming from a water scarce area, or is it from a relatively water abundant area? If we look specifically at the sugar component of this product, is the sugar coming from beets or is it coming from cane? Because each of these crops have a different water requirement. So one of them will have a higher water footprint than the other. If we look, for example, at the milk that's contained in the product, have the cows that produce the milk, have they been grain-fed or supplemental fed? Have they been grown in industrial settings, or were they able to graze openly in the fields? And finally, if you look at the coffee itself, has the coffee been produced under biological conditions or under conventional conditions? if pesticides have been used or fertilizers have been used in the crop cultivation, that might result in a gray water footprint. So once we know what elements go into a product, what are the water footprint components of those elements, we also need to ask context questions to be able to perform the sustainability assessment. So what is, in fact, a good water footprint? How can I tell as a business if my water footprint is good or if it's too high? Well, benchmarks exist for crops. This is based on research that has been carried out by Professor Hoekstra together with his colleagues. But benchmarks are needed also for a lot of other products, especially for manufactured goods, for which calculating the water footprint relies a lot on the disclosures that the companies are doing. So crop water footprints can be estimated through models, but estimating water use for producing our laptops, producing our phones, producing other types of manufactured goods is much more difficult. It's and is primarily relying on data that's reported by the companies. And this is why we believe that the application of the new regulations like the CSRD will result in the coming 10 years or so, will result in an immense amount of data that will allow the development of these type of benchmarks and will allow companies to better understand what is a good water footprint for their own sector and what type of actions they can take to reach that benchmark. Also, in terms of consumers, there are studies, or there were studies being carried out, and what you see here in this graph is the water consumption per capita for some of the countries. The world average is about 3,700 liters per capita, and we see that on the higher end of the range. We have developed countries like the USA, but also Portugal, Spain, Greece, Canada. These all have very high water footprints per capita. And of course, on the other end of the range, we have the lesser developed countries with much lower water footprints. And this is, of course, directly related to the patterns of consumption in these countries. So the more myself as a consumer I'm buying, not just in the supermarket for the food, but also gadgets, clothing, any type of item that we buy daily, the higher the water footprint. And in fact, as a consumer, if we think about our own water footprint, we tend to think about the water that comes from the taps, in the kitchen, in our bathrooms. But in fact, the largest part of our water footprint lies in our consuming patterns. And again, the numbers that you see here are averages across the world. The indirect water footprint for consumers is only about 3% of their total water footprint. So if as a consumer, we want to make changes and we want to become more sustainable in our water use, what we in fact need to do is to reduce our consumption overall. So to sum up, looking from a business perspective, what can a water footprint help us with? Well, first, it can help analyze data on water consumption in own operations and in supply chains, and it can help with reporting according to the EU regulations, so it helps us comply. It helps identify water dependencies in operations and in supply chains. It can also help set targets if we compare business water consumption with the benchmarks for the same type of sector. But also we can set targets by looking at databases such as the Science-Based Targets for Water that has been recently developed and for which the tool is going to be released quite soon via our partners at the Water Footprint Network. And it also helps us develop water strategies, policies, and actions to reduce water consumption. A few words about virtual water, the concept of virtual water and how that relates to the supply chain perspective. When we think about virtual water, as a business or as a consumer not familiar with the term, it might be a bit difficult to understand what we are referring to. But as the name says, of course, we're not referring to the physical water that's embedded in a product. So if you buy a can of Coca-Cola, for example, we're not referring to the water that's contained in the drink, but we are referring to the water that has been consumed in the production of the bottle of Coca-Cola. If we look at this map, what we see here is the virtual water imports to Europe. And we can see the darker the red, the higher the amount of virtual water imported. And the green colors represent the countries that export virtual water. And we see that Europe is a net importer of water, and this virtual water can come in the form of soy, for example, from Brazil, or in the form of maize through imports from the US, or rice and cotton from China and India. On this map, we see the blue water footprint of humanity. The darker the red, the higher the number of months in which a country has to deal with water scarcity. And we can see that parts of the world, such as Northern and Southern Africa, Australia, the US, India, they all have to deal with water scarcity for a period of 4 to 12 months a year. And if we juxtapose these two maps, if we compare them, we actually see that regions such as Europe that are relatively abundant in water resources are importing precious water resources in form of virtual water from countries that have to deal with water scarcity all year round. So again, we have to ask ourselves, is this wise? And what happens when the situation in those regions from which we import virtual water becomes worse and worse? So what the concept of virtual water, in fact, brings to light is the fact that fresh water doesn't have only a local dimension or a regional dimension, which has been the traditional way of looking at water, right? So if I'm a company and I'm using water from a specific river basin or a specific country for my operations, I'm only looking at my impact on that specific water body. As a company, you also have to look and take responsibility for the impacts that you might have in the supply chain. And to bring these supply chain impacts to light, you first have to be able to track the flows of virtual water. And this is something that we're not just doing as a theoretical exercise. You have also seen that regulations at EU level, the CSRD and the other directives that I've mentioned, they are starting to require companies to take the supply chain perspective and to start collecting the data, to start getting transparency in their supply chains, and to provide the information that's necessary for regulators and for financial investors, to take sustainably informed decisions. And I'm also mindful of the time. The final part of the talk today will be focusing on a business case, looking at how a water footprint assessment can work for a business. And in this case, we will look at a case study for a brewery here in the Netherlands. Just as a short recap, for this specific brewery, we went through the 4 phases of the water footprint assessment. starting with setting the goals, accounting for the water footprint, a short sustainability assessment, and finally the response formulation. In setting the scope, what we decided together with the company is that we will focus specifically on the operations of the company in the Netherlands. It's important to note that the company itself is one of the most sustainable beer producers in the world. So all their operations, in fact, are based in a region of the Netherlands from which they also source most of their ingredients. So their supply chain is very close to home, so to say. They work with a concept called the 25-mile concept, meaning that they try to source all the ingredients from within a 25-mile radius. Of course, that's not always possible. So some of their ingredients are also sourced internationally, but I think more than 90% of what they use in the production of the beer is very local. So we decided to only include the water that's used in the crop cultivation, in the malt house, and in the brewery processes. And we only looked at 4 of the beer types to be able to perform a comparison between these type of beers. And we decided to leave outside of the boundary of the analysis things such as the packaging, the transport, the energy that's been used in the production, and a few other non-essential overhead components. Looking at the accounting phase for their direct water footprint, again, we were lucky that the specific brewery had very good records of their water consumption, not just overall for their plant, but also broken down for each of the process steps. And here, the text is in Dutch. It was a bit difficult to translate. But just to get an idea, this is the level of detail that the company was able to supply us with. And in fact, what we could derive from this data was the amount of water that was used for the 4 types of beer directly in the brewing process. And you can see here that this ranges somewhere between 1.5 liters to 2.7 liters per beer, direct water use. In the accounting for the indirect water footprint, we used data both from the farmers that were supplying the brewery with the crops and the hops necessary for the production of the beer, and data from our own database on the water footprint of those specific crops. And what you see here in these figures is the share of green, blue, and gray water footprint in each of the types of beer. And the focus here lies on showing that the largest component of the indirect water footprint is the green. So I think all of the crops that are being used in the brewing process that are located in the Netherlands are purely rain-fed. There's no irrigation taking place. And only the crops that are being imported from outside of the Netherlands have a small blue water footprint component, meaning that irrigation is being used in the cultivation of those crops. And we also see that there's a gray element of water footprint that relates to the fertilizer use in the growing of the crops. The final accounting result, so looking at the total water footprint, direct plus indirect, for each of the type of beers, we see that there are quite some differences between between the beer with the lowest water footprint and the beer with the largest water footprint. There's almost a twofold difference. So the lowest water footprint for the simple beer is 32 liters, and the beer with the highest water footprint amounts to 60 liters per beer. And this also corresponds to the type of beer that's biologically produced. In the sustainability assessment phase, we looked at how efficiently the crops are grown, so specifically barley and hops. And we compared the water footprint of these two crops that are being grown in that specific region of the Netherlands with the same type of crops that are grown in a few of the countries across the world that are high producers for barley and hops. And we can see that, happily in the Netherlands, barley and hops are being produced very efficiently. So they are very close to the international benchmark. And they perform a lot better than, for example, barley that's being produced in Russia or hops that's being produced in Ethiopia or the Czech Republic. So this is just to put things in perspective and to help the company understand if they were to reduce their water footprint at crop level, would they have to look at different suppliers? Would they have to look further away from their operations, from their place of operations? Or in this case, happily, they do not need to take action in this sense. And in the final phase of providing response measures, this was, let's say, again, a bit of a happy case because the company was had already included a lot of sustainability practices in their operations. Their supply chain was very close to home. They were already using biologically grown crops for some of their beers. So there was very little that we could provide as additional actions. But we looked at a few, at one of the main climate scenarios provided by the Dutch Meteorological Institute. And we could see that in the next 30, 40 years or so, there is a tendency also for the Netherlands to become drier, which means that the crops that are now very highly dependent on rainwater could be affected in the future and productivity could decline. So in this scenario, to keep the productivity up, the farmers might need to supplement the rainwater through irrigation. To already be prepared for that scenario, we think that the brewery should start going into discussions with other water users in the region who will have to face the same scenario of increasing water scarcity and increasing competition for the same scarcer resources in the future. To be able to respond to that timely, the conversations and the stakeholder engagement needs to start happening now. So what we've recommended to the brewery is that they start engaging with other water users in the region, that they start engaging with the water authorities, with the provincial authorities, to be able to develop together a strategy and an action plan for this scenario. So this is how a water footprint assessment translates into practice for a business. And this is also where I finish my talk, and I think right on time. If there are any questions, from what I understand, all questions need to be shared in the chat.